When I came into law school in the early 1970s at the University of Toronto, you could volunteer to work in a student legal aid clinic to help people and get some practical experience with being a lawyer. And so I didn't know what the Spanish Center was. I just signed up for it, and I have to say it opened an entire new world for me because as a result of working at that center, I learned Spanish along with a number of my classmates and was introduced to Latin America. I mean, it was the history, the culture, the people, and the thing about that time was that many of the people coming to the Center for Spanish-Speaking Peoples were refugees from South America, so from Chile and then later Argentina and Uruguay. And they were like us, they were university students, but they had to flee because of the violence, the political repression in their countries. So that was the biggest kind of case that we did, was helping people be recognized as refugees. And I would say the other one, and largely for economic, if not economic and political reasons, was illegals, people who'd remained in the country for many years without status. Those were the two biggest kinds of cases that we saw. I think Toronto was a central point, first because there was others here already, and I think that's true with most refugee communities and most immigrant communities. You go where you know you're going to find people that that speak your language and that can help you in settling. With that group, the South Americans that came through the 70s, they were urbanized already. They were used to big cities. And so Toronto wasn't such a big change. I think with the Central Americans that came later, Toronto was a big change because they hadn't been living in huge cities. There was a hosting program that Canada had where refugees accepted outside of Canada were brought in, and there were a number of South Americans brought in that way, and they were settled in places like Regina and Saskatoon and Winnipeg. And it's interesting because a fair number of them stayed there, but a lot of them migrated to Toronto because there was a huge Spanish-speaking population in Toronto. We worked with a group of women who were cleaners. They signed contracts to clean buildings, and when you figured out the actual rate that they were being paid, it was like 50 cents or 70 cents an hour or something like that. It was far, far below minimum wage. They had to pay for supplies, they had to pay for the contract. It was totally against the law. So we brought a challenge under the Employment Standards Act, arguing that really they were employees and the employer was making it look like they were self-employed contractors so they could not have to pay minimum wage. And in the end we won that, but that was typical of what was going on in the immigrant community. They didn't speak English, most of them. They learned over time, but they didn't at the time when they started a clean contract. And they weren't being paid properly. It wasn't even enough to live on. That's probably the most important. The important thing you can do is to help people become participants in the community. When I first started, the refugee movement that was coming was from Chile, then Argentina and Uruguay in terms of the military coups that took place there. And then after that, there was a movement of Central Americans, and as I said, that was mostly an overland movement coming through the United States. And because the United States weren't accepting very many Guatemalans or Salvadorians, I think their acceptance rate was like 1% for one country and 3% for the other. Canada had like 97% acceptance rate through those years, very high. So the church groups in the States would direct the Central Americans to Canada, and there was a large overland movement of Central Americans. And then in more recent years, the problems in Mexico and Colombia are what's led to refugee movements of people coming to Canada from that part of the world. I think it's unfortunate for the countries that lose those people. Because they really, you know, what I realized as a student very early on is that most of the refugees we were getting were the educated class in the country. They were the ones being targeted for political activism. So we benefited, and I think that's still true today. I mean, you look at almost every refugee movement, the people coming are usually well-educated, pretty well-educated, or university students, people who, the kind of people you expect a state to target when they want to repress a democratic movement. I spoke at one of the bar admission courses, a bar admission call to the bar a couple of years ago, And I would say over 50% of the students had names from different countries and were students of color of different backgrounds. And you know, that's wonderful. Like, it is so multicultural, Toronto is. And I think the Center for Spanish-Speaking People played a huge role in that. Nowadays, I mean, we learned Spanish because there weren't Spanish-speaking lawyers. Nowadays, how many? Dozens and dozens of Spanish-speaking lawyers where Spanish is their first language are part of the bar. I mean, it's wonderful, the process that's gone on. And I think it really started from the late 60s onwards. And through the refugee movements, Canada has benefited, Toronto especially has benefited from the talent that's come through the different Central and South American refugee communities.